Thank you for inviting me. I'll talk to you today about one stream of my research which deals with how new words are integrated into the mental lexicon. And as most of you will know, in our L1, our first language, we have a mental lexicon. And words are connected in various ways to the concepts they carry. Whereas what happens when we learn a new language, well, new words have to be somehow integrated into that lexicon. And that's what I'll talk about today. So a quick overview of what's going to happen today. First, we'll look at models of L2 word representation and bilingual memory organization. Then we're going to look at, from a psycholinguistic point of view, at how we can test these models experimentally, briefly. And then we'll focus on factors that influence novel L2 word learning. And finally, we'll end with a discussion. Hopefully at the end, we can also have a discussion together. We can also conduct this in German if you'd rather do that, but English is fine, German is fine. Dutch if you want to, but I've been told maybe that's not the language of choice here. So the question is, why do we learn new L2 words? That's my first question. So evidently we learn new L2 words for meaningful interaction in order to use them when we can and when we need to use those, right? Now the question is, how do we actually use those words and how can we fit them into our lexicon? There are three very influential models of L2 word representation and bilingual lexicon representation. These, one of a very old one is that by Weinreich, who looked at bilinguals predominantly. Then Mary Potter, not related to Harry Potter, but Mary Potter and colleagues looked more at how new words are learned by L2 learners. And they suggested a specific way of this happening, and then Kroll and Stewart in '94, which is more than 20 years ago, merged this, and I will look at this in detail now. So the model that Weinreich suggested had either a coordinate view where concepts, and here the concepts are at the top and the word forms are at the bottom. That will swap in a minute, but for now that's the way it is. The concept we have is basically nonverbal. The concept is more or less the picture we have of something specific and all the semantic field that surrounds it and everything that we connect to it. And then we have, at least that's what Weinreich suggested, we have connections to the word forms, to the orthography and phonology of these words. And this would be a classical view back then, more than 50 years ago, how someone who learns an L2 at a later date connects these. So you see that there are basically two separate lexicons and two separate word forms and two separate concepts. He also suggested something that he called a compound bilingual, and that would be someone who has one concept for any entry into the lexicon, but two word forms, the L1 and the L2 word form. These would be bilinguals who learned, and stereotypically from birth onwards, who were subjected to two languages. And then this is the subordinate kind of bilingual, possibly someone who learned an L2 at a very late date and who always goes via the L1 word form to access the concept. Okay? Now this is a very early view, and about 20 years later or 30 years later, Potter and colleagues suggested this kind of model for the organization of words. And here you can see now the concept is at the bottom. You all know what this is. Well, here are the words connected to this. And I'm always using L1 German and L2 English as examples today, fitting for the context here. So we have a word association model where any kind of concept basically automatically is linked to the L1 word. So these are the words we learn when we grow up, right? Now, if we learn a second language later on, what happens, or what can happen, is that we link the L2 word directly to the L1 word. And through that L1 word, we can access the concept. That would be the word association model. As an alternative, and possibly for someone who's bilingual or highly proficient L2 learner. The Potter and colleagues suggested the concept mediation model. So these were the two models that depicted several or different stages of learning, possibly, of the L2. And in the concept mediation model, both the word forms were connected to the concept. So there was direct access. This is the red arrow right here. Direct access from the L2 word to the concept. One could then already assume or make predictions about performances in translation. And that's what we'll get to in a bit. But as you can see here, if I have to translate a word from L2 to L1 or L1 to L2, possibly these different models can make different predictions about your performance, how fast you perform something, okay? Simply because here you have a direct access and here you have a sort of indirect access to the concept, okay? 10 years later, the revised hierarchical model by Kroll and Stewart merged these two and put them into one model. And this has been very influential in the past 20 years in psycholinguistic research on L2 word learning, simply because it lets you test all the predictions that one could have and actually test this experimentally. Now up here we have the language-specific word forms. As you can see, the L1 store for words is larger than the L2 store. So this would be something that you'd expect in learners, right? You usually know fewer words in your L2 than in your L1. And for beginning learners, you'd have a strong link between the L2 word and the L1 word, okay? Now we'll get back to this a few times because we can, again, test these predictions. The conceptual links between concept and L2 are very weak, whereas the conceptual links between L1 words and the concept are very strong, okay? That would be the starting point. And what this model allowed us to do is to look at various stages of learning, of proficiency in L2 learners, and then to see how these links change over time in strength. Now, how have these been tested in the past? Well, the RHM has been tested predominantly using lexical decision tasks, which we'll look at in a minute, and also translation tasks. Keep in mind that the RHM was originally devised to explain production, only language production, but in the past it's also been used to test comprehension. Now before we run any kind of task in psycholinguistics, what we also need to do is we need to look at confounding factors. And these would be research considerations that one always has to take into account before you start looking at what L2 learners or bilinguals or how they perform. And these specific factors, if you fail to control these, then you may have confounding factors, and it would make it much more difficult to then explain certain patterns of performance and link it to very specific things like proficiency, okay? Particularly if you say that proficiency is the driving factor in performance differences between groups, then you want to only have proficiency differ between groups and nothing else. Some of these can be experimental variables. So you will have to make sure that the stimuli you're using are all matched between conditions because you will always have different conditions. So the length of words, for instance, or their frequency in daily use, or their orthographic neighborhood size, for instance. And then the participant variables that are very important, particularly in group designs, are the age of participants, when they learned the second language, how long they've been instructed, language proficiency, and predominantly socioeconomic status here. Okay? That's just a general consideration before you run any kind of research. Now, as an example, we'll look at a study that I ran for my PhD. This was run in the Netherlands. We tested 60 Dutch kids who were beginning learners of L2 English. And these were between 10 and 11, these kids. And they'd had English instruction for 8 months. And as I think in Germany is the case as well, how many hours do kids have English? Wait, is this 5th grade? Yes, this is 5th grade. In 5th grade, how many hours a week do German kids have of English instruction? 2, right? Of 90 minutes. Okay, that would be 3 hours, right? Okay. More or less the same. Okay. So for us, these kids predictively were beginning learners, right? We might have to come back to this because the Dutch environment may differ slightly from the German environment, but nevertheless, these for us were beginning learners. Now, we ran 2 experiments with them. One was a translation recognition task. The traditional translation recognition task can either be used, if you flash words on the screen, and you have to decide, yes, this is a word, or no, this is not a word. And then you would use pseudo words or real words. You can also do this across language, and it would work like this, okay? So these are now Dutch words, but I think you'll be able to figure these out, right? So, yeah, it's a cognate with German, right? This would be an Ente. Am I right? Okay, so I know German too. So you always see the L1 word first, no, the L2 word first, and then the L1 is flashed after that, okay? The first word disappears, then the second word comes up, and the participant, or the children in this case, have to decide. They have 2 buttons, either yes or no. That's why you have the button press yes here, okay? So that's the easy one. Now comes the second condition, which is a semantically related condition. Now, why do we have this? Well, I'll explain in a minute using the model again, but the semantically related condition is very important for us because it has to have something semantically to do with the word we're trying to translate. And here we have this word. What is that in German? Very good. You all know Dutch. Good. Here we have to press no, right? That's important. Good. And the third condition, and these 2 conditions are the ones we're later on going to compare, is the unrelated condition, so semantically unrelated. Here we have a word that has nothing to do with birds or whatever. Does anyone know what this means? Yes? Customer. Very good. Okay. Customer has nothing to do with a duck, besides if you go into a duck store and you want to buy a duck. But that's semantically odd, right? Again, you have a no button press, okay? Now, why are these 2 the relevant conditions or the critical conditions? Well, they allow testing the predictions by the RHM. How so? If I'm affected by semantically related words, I have to have had accessed the concept. Otherwise, the semantic field will not have been accessed, okay? And for beginning learners, what I'm assuming and predicting is that if beginning learners do not yet have direct access to their concept, then they will be using the lexical link between L2 and L1, and they'll basically translate directly, and they'll make a decision based on that without accessing the concept first, and the concept connected to the semantic field, right? Whereas if I'm more proficient, I will automatically, even in L2, because this link has been strengthened by my growing proficiency, I will access the concept and then proceed to the L2 word, okay? By doing that, I will activate the semantic field around it, and thus I'll be influenced by any semantic competitor, okay? So again, I'll go back. If I'm a beginning learner, these 2 conditions, they won't differ because everything will be unrelated for me because I'm not accessing the concepts yet and the semantic field. If I'm more proficient, I'll be influenced by this making my performance slower because I'm activating the semantics around it, and then it's going to take me longer to say, oh, Swan, it's in the semantic field, it was already activated, but no, it's not the right translation, okay? And that's how we can test these predictions. And we'll look at the performance of these kids in this kind of task. Okay, went through that. The second experiment was a translation production task, where you basically had to either forward translate or backward translate these words. We're using the same words, that's easy, right? You see a word and then you have to utter the word into a microphone. What is usually measured here is the reaction time, how quickly you do it, and the error rates, how well you actually perform the tasks. So how many of these words you actually are able to translate. Whereas in the recognition task, the reaction time until you press the button and whether you press the correct button is measured. So you have 2 measures. You have reaction times and accuracy rates. Okay? Now, given that we had specific predictions before in the translation recognition task, we have the same here. Same setup again. Okay, and this would be and now we're only assuming that these are beginning learners. Okay? Again, beginning learners have a weak conceptual link between L2 word and the concept. Thus, when they have to translate backwards from the L2 to the L1, they will use this strong link. Again, these are all predictions. which we'll then have to test against the results we get, right, from their performance. The forward translation would look like this. It's basically turned around what we saw before for the possibly more proficient L2 speaker. So the forward translation, if you see the L1 word, automatically, because these are stronger links, you activate the concept. And then you have to go and try to find the L2 word that belongs to it, okay? So this link won't be used as much simply because you automatically activate the concepts in the semantic field, okay? So again, if you have this constellation in beginning learners, which one's going to take longer, which one's going to be faster? That's a good question. So is backward or forward translation going to be faster? You just look at the model. This is a direct link, and this is basically a detour. So this one's going to be faster than this one. That's our prediction, okay? Good. So what did we find here? Well, we found two different things depending on the experiment. In experiment 2, we found that, yes, for the production task, evidently, these kids still relied on the lexical link in the backward translation. So they were faster translating from the L2 English to Dutch than the other way around. So evidently, yes, for production, and that's important, there was a clear indication that the beginning learners, the way they performed, showed that the RHM made valid predictions. Okay? Whereas for experiment 1, we found results which were not in line with the RHM or the predictions by the RHM, and that was they already showed semantic interference, which as beginning learners they shouldn't have shown. So evidently, there are two things that we took from this. One, it depends a bit on the task demands, so whether you're producing something or whether you're just listening or you're reacting to visual cues. That's one issue, but that would be more in the research design. The other is, and that's when we come back to the Dutch environment, two things. In the Dutch school system, there has been a shift in the past 20 years from doing things like this. So basically just linking words together. That's how I learned French. And that's why I do not speak French. So vocabulary lists, plain vocabulary lists. To more meaningful interaction and contextual learning. Okay? So evidently the learning context or the learning method has a clear impact on the way basically the model in your head is formed and whether links are strengthened or not. Okay? And this is what I'm going to use as a cue for the next part of my presentation. Okay? So evidently learning method is one of the factors that features heavily in how you link words in your L2 to the concepts. So in the past 10 years, thus, there's also been a move towards trying to find which kind of learning method actually is more successful. And here we're possibly moving away from the experimental setup that I've used and simply using research designs where you have a pretest of groups of children and then you give them various learning methods and then at the end you give them a post-test and you see which of the kids remembered more words. Okay, that would be a simple setup. And here we have two methods that have been used in the past. That's the picture-based method where you see pictures and you have to map the words to them, or you have I'll call it old school word-based method where you just sort of link the words to one another through vocabulary lists. That would be one of the issues that research has used. The other is looking at the word type or word status. So here, particularly cognates and non-cognates have been used in the past, and also abstract versus concrete nouns. Now, what I showed you before, a duck is pretty concrete, right? It's not so abstract. But we might talk about this a bit in a minute as well. So we'll focus first on a learning method. The picture-based method would be this. So if I were to show you this, and what are we doing? We're linking the L2 word to the picture. So this would be in English. So you see the picture and then you have to name it. Now. Window. I heard one window. Everyone else? Okay, yes, window. Okay. And again, what would I measure? I would measure after the onset of the picture, how long it takes you to actually utter this word, right? That would be good. Or whether you know the word. That's also something I can measure. And the word-based method would be this. Very good. Or bicycle. Well, both would be fine, okay? Good. The second thing I've just pointed out was the word status, and this would be cognates.
Could you explain again what cognate is?
That's what I'm going to show you right now. I'm going to explain it using this. So what do we hear? In English? Cat. That's an easy one. So this is a non-full overlapping cognate. Okay? A full overlapping cognate between German and English would be baby. So words that have the same stem, that mean the same thing, have a very similar or the same form, and possibly also sound very much the same. Now with baby, I would say that that's one of the almost full overlap words, although baby is not pronounced exactly the same way in German and English, right? Now cat and Katze are a bit further apart, but they still have the same stem, more or less same beginning. So this would also be considered a cognate. Another one would be house. What else can I think of? Can you think of anything else? Mouse. Kindergarten, yeah, is that a cognate? It's exactly the same word, right? Yeah, I guess. Good. So then we also have non-cognates. I put that in to test. Very, very good. The armadillo came quickly. Okay, this is an armadillo. I always use this because you can also see that here, if you're going to compare cognates and non-cognates, you're going to have to make sure that in both sets of words that you use, you're not only going to use one word, right, in each condition. You're going to have like 30 or 40 words. You're going to have to make sure that in each condition, the length of the word is matched and also the frequency. Now, cat is a very high frequency word, and it's a short word, right, 3 letters. Armadillo is a very low frequent word because you don't hear that very often. Besides, you live in New Mexico, I guess, or somewhere down there. Then you might encounter armadillos more often, and it's much longer, okay? Good. So anyway, those are the types of words that have been used also to see which ones are remembered better after any learning session. And one could probably assume that the cognates are probably easier to, remember. There was a study by Lotton de Groot in the 90s, and they tested exactly these two things, learning method and word status, in young university students in the Netherlands. And these students learned novel Italian words. So this would have been their L3, right? And the results, and again, I'm not going to go into detail so much and show you graphs. I'm just going to tell you the word-based method evidently was more productive here. It was better. The participants knew more of the Italian words using the word-based method, okay? These were young adults, I think, between 20 and 25-ish, something like that. A word-based method better than the picture-based method, and cognates were easier to learn than non-cognates, okay? Good. The cognates versus non-cognates, I understand. Word-based method versus picture-based method, don't know. A few years later, 10, 11 years later, Tanzar and colleagues more or less ran something very similar, but now with young children. And these were L1 Italian kids who were learning both German words and English words. And there were two groups, 9-year-olds and 13-year-olds, to also see whether age made a difference here. But what Tanzar and colleagues found was that the picture-based method worked better with these kids, okay, than the word-based method. So linking the picture to the word evidently led to a better performance after a certain period. And the cognates facilitated learning more for the older kids. So the 9-year-olds didn't show a preference so much that they performed better with cognates versus non-cognates, but the older kids did. Now, the question that I always have when I look at these two studies is, why is there a discrepancy in which method works better? So remember, we had Dutch university students who learned better with the words, and we have 9 to 13-year-old kids who learn better with pictures. Now, the question is age the only relevant factor here? And my students always say, well, yeah, the younger kids learn better with pictures and adults learn better with word association. And I don't believe that. So my take on this, and I haven't been able to show this, was that possibly these young university students in the 90s had learned exactly like this when they were young. So possibly they'd learned word-to-word association when they were in school, like me. And if you're used to that, possibly later on when you test it again, you just can do this better because you're more used to it. Whereas the kids that were tested 5-6 years ago may have actually learned with more, let's say, up-to-date methods, more with contextual cues, more with linking it to the semantic field, and thus they were better using the picture method. Okay? That's my hunch on this. So I would not necessarily say that kids learn differently than adults, and I have no inkling of any study that actually has shown that. Okay? Good. So we'll move to, how much time do we have? I'm going through this quicker than I thought, but that's fine. We have more time to discuss things then. So I'll move to other factors that may actually influence how you learn words in your L2. One of these is concreteness. The other is valence, so emotional content. That means whether something's positive, negative, or neutral. Then the time intervals between learning. Imitation versus retrieval practice. That is possibly something I'll go into detail more. Then using gestures to support learning. And finally, learner types or learning styles. It's an assortment that I've sort of picked from the field of papers that I've found. There are possibly many other factors that come into play too. Concreteness and valence. So Ferret and colleagues very recently used concreteness and valence in a learning paradigm, and they found that that participants were better able to retrieve information that they'd learned previously if there was an emotional content to it. Okay, so particularly negative valence had a boosting effect on being able to retrieve the words. And I think that's a sign that if something is somehow emotionally more salient, that it's possibly easier to link to semantic information in your lexicon anyway. And this is particularly for abstract nouns, where it's possibly harder to find a direct translation to your L1 word. Okay? And the abstract neutral words, simply those without really any emotional content, were the hardest to learn and to retrieve after a learning period. Then we move to time intervals. So time intervals between learning to maximize long-term memory retention. So we study something and then we have some kind of gap, and then we study it again, and then there's a delay, and then we test this, right? This is something, all of you are becoming or are teachers, right? So this is something you do all the time. The question is, why do you do it? Because you know it works, or because you think it works? I don't know, because I'm not a teacher, so I'll have to probably let you decide on this. But research has evidently not been very clear on this in the past, and Carpenter and colleagues say that from the reviews that they've done on papers that have looked at this, that re-exposing students to previously learned vocabulary, particularly cumulatively, so actually adding on to something they've learned before and repeating things, makes most sense instead of just learning new words again without repeating the others. I guess that's something that you'll do in foreign language teaching anyway. Yes? No? Yes? My main question is here, do you actually have time for this in your syllabus? So if you have a specific syllabus and you have to learn new content every other week and you have to move on, do you actually always have time to repeat something that was learned before? Yes or no? No. Sometimes, right? So, I mean, this could guide one to actually try to incorporate that more, simply because long-term retention basically thrives on repetition in some way, and possibly cumulative repetition. The issues with the syllabus or the textbooks one uses, it's not always easy to repeat things if there's a totally new subject or totally new kind of issue that's being handled in subsequent hours of teaching. Then we have imitation versus retrieval. I just recently found this article and I found it very interesting because what in the past has been done very often is some kind of imitation training. So what they did here is they had two conditions, the imitation condition and the retrieval practice condition. They always showed a picture first, then there was a break, and then the L2 word that fit the picture was played, and then the learner had to repeat this. Okay? So that's basic imitation, right? Then you had retrieval practice, show a picture again, 2 seconds, and then they had the learner produce the word before he or she heard it. And afterward, there was basically feedback in some way. Now the word was played. And evidently, this kind of setup, if the word is played, confirming the picture basically, it breaks this feedback loop, this processing loop that participants or that learners need to be able to link the picture to whatever they're producing. And if they have to produce it first and then hear some kind of feedback or corrective feedback, this leads to better results than pure imitation. I found this interesting because it goes a bit against what one would expect, but evidently if you see a picture and you have to retrieve the word, it boosts performance long term simply because you don't have someone else basically giving it away for you. That's how I see this. Then we have gestures. So we're moving a bit across a few fields here, but bear with me. What gestures have been suggested for learning L2 words simply because the L1 word and link to the concept have already been embodied. And one usually would know with L1 words, if one had to gesture them in some way, you would know what to do. And evidently, if you can link that with the L2 word as well and use the first language embodiment you'd have, or the first language gesture, that this can help in the retrieval of the L2 word later on. So long-term retention evidently also profits from gestures. The challenge to this is finding gestures to fit various kinds of words. Now with action words, this would probably be easier. So if you have to link to go or to walk, you could just start walking, right? And that would be your gesture to it, in a way, or your movement. I would actually not only call it gestures, but possibly movement as well. Now with abstract words, it might be trickier, right, to do that. So how would you gesture thought? Yeah, you do something here, right? It's not quite as one-to-one mapping, but there could be something there. And then function words, I could not come up with anything, but I'm not creative, so that's something that you might want to have to think of, okay? And here, possibly this is something that you can actually have your pupils try to come up with something that would link a gesture to a specific word, right? And have them think of this in any other language they know. This could be German or other languages, right? So evidently, using gestures can also sort of function as a bridge between the L1 and L2 word. And again, I think it also would play into activating the concept while you're linking the words into your lexicon, and not so much the one-to-one lexical link between the words. And finally, I also found something that evidently doesn't work. I've heard about learner types a lot in the past, and I've always been told, yeah, you have to cater to each student's learner type. That's a nice idea. The question is, if you have 25 to 30 kids in your English group or English class, will you be able to figure out every kid's learner type? That's a real question. Who has used learner types in the past? Or who thinks learner types are something to follow? Well, I'm not going to have you answer that. It seems as though there's no conclusive evidence that these learner types actually profit from being catered to. So what Macedonia says here is that if you try to actually impoverish your L2 input by only using one channel, so be it auditive or visual or whatever, then possibly this reduces the chances of learning specific L2 words. And including multiple modalities, so all of them, as many as possible, evidently leads to better results. It's probably easier in a classroom situation anyway, where you can't try to, or you could try, but it's very difficult to cater to everyone's needs in that respect. So using multiple modalities probably is a better way of reaching everyone anyway. Okay? So I've not found much on this, but possibly this is a bit overrated. But I'm not going to take a stance here because I haven't researched this. It's just an interesting recent paper that I found. The general limitations to the field of research in general on L2 word learning and how we can test specific predictions, also made by the model, is that learners don't only learn nouns, right? And what we use a lot is nouns, concrete nouns. So we had the cat before and the window and the armadillo. And that's possibly easier to deal with in an experimental context. There are other words that could be very difficult to translate, and possibly those are words that are more abstract. So I could only think of 3, but maybe you have more. Those are the ones that I came up with. And we just had Fremdschämen when we talked earlier, right? Now, I have no idea how to translate these into English. And what you usually have to do is somehow describe them more in more words, right? But there's no one-to-one mapping. So that can be tricky for research as well, for experimental research, because how are you going to deal with these? So my question is, would these have a shared conceptual representation with bilinguals or language learners? And so do the concepts always fully overlap? And we might not have to take words that we can't really translate. There may also be a translation in the other word, but a slightly different meaning, right? I think there are words in Russian that you can translate into English, but the meaning is not entirely the same. So one would have to revise this model we looked at before, and also see that sometimes the concepts actually don't overlap at all, or only very little. Also, research so far has basically hinted at the fact that the words are not in separate lexicons, but that there's one big lexicon, and the words are embedded in there, and they're just linked in a network. That's why I put this nice box around the two words. So, to summarize, the factors that facilitate learning L2 words basically are all geared towards strengthening this connection. Okay? So, using pictures with words strengthens this link. Using more context, particularly with abstract words, strengthens this link. And using gestures, I feel, also strengthens it because the concepts are more involved. So evidently we're doing something by using these facilitatory factors that you want to do anyway. So when you learn in L2, your ultimate goal would be to become fully proficient or proficient in some way. And what you really want to do is you want the processes to become automatic, as they are between L1 and the concepts. So when you see a word in L1, or you see something, and then you process it automatically, because the concept is brought up. Otherwise, you wouldn't know what it is, right? You see a cat, you know it has 4 legs, it purrs, it wants food all the time. It wakes you up at night, like last night. So that's something that happens automatically. In L2, when you learn words, it doesn't happen automatically yet. And at a specific point, you've used that word so often that possibly you have strengthened this. And all these strengthen exactly that link. There are 2 more factors that we talked about. One is the revision and doing this cumulatively. at specific intervals. Evidently the intervals, whether it was several weeks or not, was not as relevant as repeating these. And we looked at retrieval practice compared to imitation, and evidently retrieval practice, so you see a word and then you have to produce it yourself before you get feedback, evidently is better at helping you retrieve the words later on. And finally, that's the last point we looked at, catering to learner types may in essence be counterproductive, at least from the papers that I've read. So finally, that was 45 minutes. I'm going to read this. No, you can read it. No, I'll read it. I'll read it. I hate reading from slides. This is basically from my 2012 paper almost. So in teaching, what we could try to do is place less stress on translating L2 words. So not so much the vocabulary lists. That would be the paired associate learning, because it strengthens the lexical link between the L2 word and the L1 word. A link that we actually don't want to use at a specific point when we become proficient enough. We want to use the conceptual link that links it to the concept. And that's why using as much meaningful context as we can that will automatically activate the concept is something that will foster the development of the L2 to word form concept connections, and thus long-term the retrieval or the ability to retrieve L2 words automatically. And this is the long-term goal of L2 vocabulary acquisition anyway. Thank you very much.